Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I'm back to talking about budget camera again, and I think it's just an appropriate time because it's hitting the end of the year and I'm sure a lot of you are actually looking for, old tech to actually explore and also experiment with. And in this video we'll be talking about the Nikon D40 because it is cheap nowadays and also it does still produce really nice images. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Nikon D40, now this camera has been out since 2006. That being said, it is still a very tough and reliable camera, especially for an entry-level camera. And yes, it does have the the D40X as its the higher resolution sibling, and also that camera can go lower in terms of ISO, which is really nice. But this camera is still a really nice camera to really consider if you're looking to get into, let's say, beginner photography, but also a kind of photography that you're looking to get those nostalgic digital look, because with the older digital sensor in here, you do get that old kind of older nostalgic digital vibe with the images. So yeah, that's really nice. And before we dive deeper into this video, I would like to just make it clear that this is my thought video on this camera. It's not a full review. There are a lot of full reviews out there, but I'm just making this my thought video just like any other my thought videos on any cameras, in case it might actually help you guys out, because it's just purely based on my opinion on using this camera. So now, with that out of the way, I would also like to say one more thing before diving deeper into the video, which is this camera does not have a video mode. So stop asking if this camera actually has video, because I've been getting a lot of questions on videos like the 30D, the 40D, the 50D, the D5000. Well, actually that one actually records video, but like the D300, the D200, things like that, even the D1X, they don't have video mode. But yeah, with that out of the way, I hope I've saved you guys, well, most of you, a lot of time. And now back into the video. Just like in any of my other My Thought videos on my cameras, I'll be dividing into 3 different sections. The first one, I'll be talking about the operational side of things, the usability, the ergonomics, then leading down into the image quality, what I think about it, and then leading down into the conclusion, what I think about it. So let's first start with the ergonomics, the usability, and obviously the build quality. The build quality, the ergonomics of this camera is actually quite nice, especially for an entry-level camera. So if you use something like a D3000, the D5000, when you press on the camera, the plastic actually bends a little bit. Whereas with this D40, the plastic actually stays to its form factor, which is something I personally really appreciate. And moving to the next point, which is the button layout. The button layout on this camera is actually quite nice and minimalistic. The only downside about it is that I find that you can't really customize as much, and if you're looking for, to access, let's say, your white balance menu, your drive menu, your ISO menu, and what have you, pretty much, it's much harder, or actually much more time consuming to access with this camera. So if you like to work or operate in a certain amount of speed, then this camera might be a little bit of an inconvenience in that sense. So yeah, just keep that in mind, because a lot of times I'm actually finding myself to always access the menu, which the menu, of course, on this camera is very nicely laid out, by the way, but it's just also very time consuming. So if you're doing something like street photography or photography that requires some sort of, fast action movement, or operation in that sense, then this camera might not be for you. On to another point about speed, which is the autofocusing points. There are only 3 autofocusing points in here. They work great. They're fast enough if you're photographing cityscapes, landscapes, nature, macro close-ups, what have you. But if you're focusing on, let's say, certain kind of moving portraits, then it can be a little bit tricky, not only in terms of focusing speed, but also in terms of the fact that there are only 3 different focusing points in kind of the center, and that could be also time consuming in terms of having to focus and refocus, or focus and recompose, and making sure that your portraits will always be in focus. So yeah, it can be a little bit tricky and can be very limiting in terms of framing in time. So just keep that in mind. But otherwise, the viewfinder is actually very nice. And just above the viewfinder, you find the actual flash, the pop-up flash. What I like about this flash is that it's a little bit higher up and a little bit away from the lens, which means physically it's harder to get red eye when taking pictures with flash, especially at night. Well, portrait pictures, that is. So some cameras, the flashes are way too close to the lens that it's easier to have that red eye. So just saying, if you're into, you know, not so much into post-processing and you'd like to take pictures of like people at night, especially with flash, so yeah, just keep that in mind, that having a flash that's higher up actually helps a lot. And yeah, now onto the back of the camera. Even though the screen is 2.5 inches, it's actually still a very nice screen. It's very detailed, and you can actually view the detail of, you know, your settings quite nicely. The only downside is that when you do operate with it, the value settings does have a little bit of delay on it. If you're coming from cameras, let's say even an older camera like the D3000, this has a huge delay to the operation. So just keep that in mind if you're working a lot, let's say in terms of street photography, where you want to constantly kind of change your settings as you go into different shades of lighting, things like that. You know, the confirmation can be a little bit slow with this camera. And talking about confirmation, the metering system in this camera is a little bit weird. I know it was kind of accurate for the time that it was out, but for even compared to cameras from 8 or 9 years ago, the metering on this camera is really weird, because it tends to want to overexpose a little bit. So I always have to compensate it by at least going down to between -7 and -1.7. So I was always running between those variables when shooting in aperture priority, in manual, in shutter priority, things like that. So yeah, it's kind of weird, and it's like that regardless of which metering mode I actually select the camera to use from the metering, of course. And yeah, but that's just my nitpick. If you're just into full auto, then you know this camera will do a good job. But if you're into, let's say, semi-manual mode to manual mode, the metering mode in this camera is a little bit weird and not so precise. But yeah, otherwise, moving on to the side, this camera actually takes in SD cards, which is actually quite nice if you're, you know, into using SD cards. I personally am a huge fan of using CF cards, because I find that CF cards corrupt way less than SD cards. So, but that's just a personal preference. But I think that, you know, in general, SD cards are actually very nice to have, simply because most computers takes SD cards rather than CF cards. And moving on to the other side, there are just two ports, which is USB and video out. The video out is, of course, if you want to have your own presentation or slideshows on your TV or projector, things like that, then you can hook this camera up to a projector or to a telly and then just have the slideshow. And talking about the slideshow, there is definitely the slideshow menu in here, and you can also do basic retouching with different filters, or do basic RAW to JPEG conversion with the retouching menu within the menu. And talking about the menu system, it's actually very well organized. And being a camera that, you know, is very limited and very photography centric, it's also a very simple menu. So all of the essential things that you need is in here, and of course you won't really be kind of lost within the gimmick of different features, because this camera is pretty much still a bare bones photography camera. So all of your core essential photography settings and menu will just be in there, so you will not just get lost in the menu. Oh, and the battery life on this camera is also quite nice. So even here in winter, 1 week after the fully charged battery, it is still on almost fully charged. So I think it's around 75 or 80% at this point, but it is still a very solid battery life on this camera. And it just goes to show, you know, with the older cameras that demands less energy. Just because the battery is older does not mean that the battery won't last that long. It still lasts quite a long time on this camera, simply because this camera really requires very little amount of battery life just to activate that shutter to, you know, capture the image, things like that, and sometimes just playback, things like that. But yeah, otherwise this camera is still a very nice camera to use. It is very reliable. It only shoots 2.5 frames per second, but to be honest, in a lot of cases it is more than enough. The only downside where you want to be careful with this camera is it doesn't take all of Nikon lenses, so it only takes the newer lenses that doesn't have the motor drive. So if you buy this camera thinking that it will, take some of the older lenses where it drives, well, it has the motor in camera to drive the lens, no, it will be just full-time manual focus for those lenses. So it's very picky on that front. If you don't mind, you can actually go for an older camera like a D70, things like that, where it will actually take older lenses and it has similar feature sets to this camera. But yeah, other than that, this camera is a very easy to use camera, because if you don't want to go into like a full manual mode, things like that, there are even menu settings where you can actually shorten the menu down, or just only show the essential basic menus, and then it will actually give you guidelines on which menu to set certain settings, things like that. So it's actually a very intuitive camera that you can still learn photography with. And there are certain menus, for example, that I find that they also should add into like their basic menu, which is turning off the AF assist light, because to be honest, in the beginning, it took me a while to find in the menu where to turn it off, but apparently I had to enable the full menu sets to be able to actually turn the AF assist lamp off, because I don't like to distract my subject. So yeah, that's that. And now into the image quality. The image quality on this camera, well, it's 6 megapixels, but that's not really what I want it to be, as a point to take away. Yes, it's only 6 megapixels, but 6 megapixels is also still quite high. You still can do really clean A3 prints with it, and to be honest, if you're into nostalgic digital look, it's definitely a camera that delivers that. Where the weakness comes in is of course the dynamic range. The dynamic range on this camera is not that good, and of course there is moire and aliasing, so be careful which subjects you do shoot into, because if you're shooting into a lot of complex pattern subjects, there will be a high chance of moire and aliasing creeping into the final image. So just be careful of that. And of course, the ISO sensitivity on this camera starts at 200, unfortunately. The D40X starts at 100, where I think it's better. Not only in terms of, having that clean noise, but sometimes you really just want to shoot at that ISO just to be safe, especially during a daylight time, or during the time when you want to do super long exposure, where ISO 200 could be a little bit too high for that. So having ISO 100 on the D40X would actually be much better than having the lowest ISO of ISO of 200 on here. So yeah, that's just my take, but otherwise the color reproduction on this camera is actually quite nice. You get that very nice rendition, you get really nice color signs, really nice skin tones out of the image quality on this camera. So yeah, I can't really say bad things in terms of the color signs of this camera. Of course, the noise starts to get a bit noisy in terms of using high ISO. Let's say using ISO 800, you will already start seeing a lot of noise in there. And if you're not post-processing much, ISO 400 would be okay, ISO 800 would still be okay, but if you start to post-processing a lot, then even ISO 400 would still be quite noisy for the output of this camera. But of course, as I said earlier, the image quality is still quite nice. The color science is actually quite nice. The dynamic range, if you know its limitations, you can really work to your advantage, of course, and avoid certain too high contrasty environment. So yeah, there is that. And now on to my conclusion. Well, this camera overall, it is a fun camera to use. That being said, as I said earlier, this camera cost 40 euros as well as this camera. But of course with this camera, not only that you're getting higher resolution with the camera and also a base ISO of 100, it is a much more rugged camera as well. That being said, it is a completely different kind of camera. It is still a DSLR, but despite being fast, despite being rugged, despite being more reliable, despite being faster to operate and more convenient to operate, this offers a much lighter body. This has, a more compact size so that you can actually pack the camera and go to more places whereas with this camera it's a bit heavier. It's actually quite a bit heavier as well, so you might not want to use this camera in some situations as well. And of course, with a camera that actually takes you to more places, it also means that it will be a camera that you tend to capture more things with and come home with more images and more memories with as well. So that is just something to consider. But otherwise, this camera, apart from being a fun camera and also a slow camera to operate in the same time, but I think that it's also a nice camera to experiment because of the look that you get with the sensor of this camera. Because I really love the look, the color rendition, and I feel like if you're into exploring older color science and that nostalgic digital look, this camera is still a camera to really consider, especially for the price point. And also, even though it's an entry-level camera, it does feel very nice and solid in your hands. Of course, not solid like D200, oops, like the D200, but it is still solid for an entry-level DSLR. And of course, being a DSLR, you still can change the lens and mount different lenses to it to, you know, get different perspective, different effects, things like that. And I just think that it's a, you know, it's a camera that's worth paying the extra attention to. Of course, if you can find the D40X for the same amount of price, I would recommend that camera over this camera because of the base ISO and to a certain extent because of the resolution as well. That being said, this camera is still a very good camera, but the weakness, another weakness here is because we're spoiled with, you know, smartphone cameras, which, you know, the sensor isn't exposed all the time to the air outside, or even more modern cameras from, let's say, even 8 years ago with, you know, sensor cleaning system. This camera does not have sensor cleaning system, so a lot of times, for some reason, it actually attracts a lot more dust than even my D70, which is an older camera, but this one attracts even more dust than that. So just have to be careful and clean your sensor a bit more often. But apart from that, I think that this camera is still a good camera to consider. And I think I've pretty much made all of my points pretty clear in this video. I hope you can actually get something from this video, and if you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free on my website. The link is down in the description section below. If you have any questions, any suggestions, feel free to also write that down in the comment section below as well. And of course, I recently launched my photography courses. More courses are definitely coming up by early 2024, and some free courses are also coming up by early 2024 as well, so please keep an eye on that as well if you're interested. But yeah, otherwise, I thank you all very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.